And so one of the reasons why the dollar, as shaky as it is still viable, is that, what's the alternative? All of the alternatives are worse.
Yeah.
But I think, nobody can predict when the dollar would collapse, if it collapsed, and what would happen if that happened. We can move in two directions. We can move in the direction of hyperinflation, the government printing more and more dollars to bail itself out in its programs, or genuine monetary reform where we adopted some sort of competing currencies.
Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have Professor Thomas DiLorenzo. He's a professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a member of the senior faculty of the Mises Institute. Today he will be sharing with us his thoughts on the economy, as well as his thoughts on our current monetary system. He's the author of several great books, such as The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, and his most recent release, The Problem With Socialism. So, Professor Thomas, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Please be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to getting into this interview here. I came across your recent lecture with the Mises Institute on central banking and the corruption and origins of it. And so I thought definitely he has a unique perspective historically about our current monetary system dealing with central banks. So looking forward to getting your take on that. And before we actually get into that, I usually start off the interviews with some Rethinking the Dollar questions. And the first question is, what comes to mind when you hear the words rethinking the dollar?
Well, I think of different types of monetary arrangements. In our history in America, at one point we had competing currencies. And for example, the word Dixie that refers to the South.
Right.
But it was the word came from the word Dix, D-I-X, which means 10 in French. And it was a bank in New Orleans that issued currency, and it was backed by gold. And it was so secure, people trusted that money so much that they even used it in Minnesota. And so that's where Dixie comes from, the currency.
Mm-hmm.
And so way back in the 19th century, we had competing currencies, and banks would issue money. But if you had a good, solid, honest bank, and you could go and get your paper money and go to the bank and get gold or silver for it, people felt secure that their money was not going to be inflated away and become worthless someday. And so, but that all was eliminated when the government nationalized the money supply and put the Fed in charge. That was the year 1913. And so, since the Fed was created, the value of the dollar is less than 5 cents of what it was in 1913. As far as the value of the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And an interesting historical fact is that from the time of the U.S. Constitution, 1789, until 1913, the money in this country was about the same in terms of how inflation affected it. It had not been devalued. There have been ups and downs, but it was basically the same. Then we got the Fed, and we got a century of inflation. Price inflation.
Right.
And so that's a long-winded answer of what I think of when I think of rethinking the dollar.
No.
Can we go back to a system where money has something behind it other than politicians' promises?
Right. Well, no, that was a great explanation there, and the whole idea of Dixie. I learned something new right there, so I appreciate you, sharing that thought. Now, how important is it, because you're a professor in college now, and so you do lectures and you work with the Mises Institute. How important is it now for the millennial generation, especially, which is the target market for this interview here, to begin taking an interest in monetary history as well as their own personal financial dealings in general, more so right now than any time probably in history?
Well, sure. A lot of my college students, I'm an economics professor. They're very interested in this. I show them, I put on a screen in the classroom with a debt clock. You can go online and type in debt clock, and there's this clock that runs about 10,000 miles an hour, adding dollar after dollar to the national debt. And they become very concerned because these are young people who understand that's on me. This is my tax bill for the rest of my life. I'm going to be paying this off. When Ron Paul ran for president several years ago, he had millions of millennials behind him, and I think it was at the University of Michigan. He had something like 5,000 or 6,000 students showed up, and they began chanting spontaneously, "End the Fed, end the Fed." And it didn't come from his campaign or from him. It came from the students who had done what you're doing. They educated themselves about monetary issues, and they understood what I just said about the dollar being devalued so much. They're very concerned that their economic future is being thrown away by all these politicians and the people who run the Fed.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that's very encouraging to me that he reached so many of those people, those young people,
Right.
with just good, solid arguments, and it was very appealing. Of all the things, banking. Who would think you get 5,000 students cheering about banking policy or money policy?
Yeah.
Of all things.
So there is hope. Now, if you were, this is just a macro viewpoint now. If you were to, say, for example, everyone's tuned into this channel right now, you in front of your camera, and you were asked a question, what is the current state of our global economy? If you had to give the global state of the economy address, what all would it entail and why?
Well, there is, when you talk about the global economy, there's a lot of differences. We have a lot of differences just between the states in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Some states are more prosperous than others. Some cities are more prosperous than others. And so when you widen it to the whole world, you have some countries that are doing pretty well and others that do very poorly. But the key ingredient is always how much economic freedom do we have? Freedom to work, freedom to move around, go where we want, open a business, freedom to keep the fruits of our labor, pay taxes for the necessary things government does, but you don't want to pay 70% of your income in taxes like they do in Denmark. Yes, I don't.
Yeah.
I just read an article by a Danish economist. He said they have 180% tax on purchase of an automobile over there, and the overall tax burden is about 70%.
Wow.
And so countries like that, they're not going to grow very much. And so the state of the U.S. economy is sort of lethargic. We're sort of limping along. I just read yesterday that we've had the slowest productivity growth in 30 years. That says how much each worker produces for the economy. That's productivity. That's not what economists talk about when they talk about productivity. And so that's not good for our future. We're not producing a lot of things, very, very well right now. And I think it's probably mostly because of a lot of the uncertainty for the future that is out there.
Yeah.
And so politicians, if they just step back and leave us alone, they would reduce that uncertainty and let us go to work, and things can improve a lot.
Yeah.
But we're not. There's a country like Venezuela, for example. They've destroyed their economy by adopting socialism. And you read articles on the web now. Venezuela, people are rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food to eat. The animals in the zoos are starving to death, and they just totally destroy the place. And we're not going to become that. We've got much nicer, bigger infrastructure in our country, but we could have slow growth like we've been having for a long, long time, and that's not good for the millennials. That they want to get out of school and get jobs and have careers and start businesses, and big government is not good for that, and certainly a declining currency is not good for that.
Right. Now, the reason I came across you initially is the idea that the corrupt origins of central banking, that lecture you gave at the Mises Institute. So let's dive into that a little bit, the corrupt origins of central banking. Being that the Federal Reserve is our primary, monetary figure now, let's talk about the corruption that started the whole process of central banking up until today with our current monetary policies.
Okay, yeah, I was speaking to a classroom of students in the lecture online that you saw at the Mises Institute on Mises.org, I guess. And the point I was making is that, we have these examples of corruption today. For example, Henry Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary in the Bush administration, he leaves Goldman Sachs, where he was the head guy. He was at Goldman Sachs, a big investment bank on Wall Street. Works in the Bush administration as Treasury Secretary, and he arranged for a $180 billion bailout of this insurance company, AIG, in 2009. Well, Goldman Sachs had $18 billion in claims on AIG, the insurance company. So he essentially got $18 billion in tax money and gave it to his employer, and then he left the government and went back to Goldman Sachs. And that's I mean, that's just robbery, thievery, but it's legal, legalized theft.
Yeah.
And so, we see corruption like that. And then the response of most people is that, well, we need more moral people, more honest people. Don't put a guy like that in charge anymore. The point of my lecture was that the Fed was always set up to do that, to allow that sort of thing to happen. And I tell the story in my lecture. There's this famous, in history, I'm a history buff, among other things, there's this famous dinner held by Thomas Jefferson, of all people, in his home with Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, the president, and the Attorney General of the United States at the time. So these are, not the kind of dinner I usually have at my house. I don't usually invite that kind of people over to my house.
Yeah.
I could invite them, but they'd never show up. But anyway, Jefferson wrote this up in his memoirs, and he said, John Adams said that the British government probably had the best constitution of any country in the world, were it not for all the corruption. Alexander Hamilton, who was a champion of a national bank, he wanted the government to run the money supply. He came back and said, oh no, it's the corruption that makes the British government so good, the British Constitution so good. And Jefferson thought about that, and he said, well, Hamilton wanted the government to be much bigger than the Constitution allowed for. And he thought corruption would do that. Corruption would allow you to have a bigger government, which is what he was in favor of. And so, here's the founding father of central banking. When Ben Bernanke gave a speech a few years ago in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Fed, he called Alexander Hamilton the founding father of the Fed. Because he was the one politician back in the 1780s who wanted a national bank. It took over 100 years, but we eventually caught it, the Fed, in 1913. And so the point I was making was that it was always intended to be an engine of corruption. Thomas Jefferson called the National Bank of his time an engine of corruption that would do things like Paulson did, the story I just told you about Paulson. Yeah. And so it was always designed to do that. So you're not going to find better people because the institution is designed to corrupt politics. And Americans have known that. In the 19th century, there's a story that I think it's pretty funny. When the precursor of the Fed was called the Bank of the United States, and it showed up in the state of Ohio. And they opened up 2 branches. And the people in Ohio did not want this. They did not want this government bank run by politicians in their state. And it was corrupting and destabilized their economy. So they put a $50,000 per year tax on each branch. And this was in the 1820s, $50,000. And so the bank refused to pay. And so the state of Ohio sent armed marshals there with a big chest and walked into the vaults and took $100,000 out and left. And so they were serious about getting rid of this bank. Yeah. And they eventually did. They helped out. President Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of this bank in the 1830s. And so there were people all around the states, and the president was opposed to this because it was corrupt. So we got rid of the earlier version of this government-run bank, but then it came back, kind of like Jason in those Halloween movies, the guy killed the murderer. He keeps coming back. They kill him and he comes back again. That's what happened with our central bank.
Yeah, wow, interesting. That's a great historical aspect right there. Now let's talk about your most recent book, about socialism. What inspired that book and how did it come about? Because you mentioned socialism in Venezuela as an example. How does that relate to where we're at now, and what do you see the future here in America for our socialism?
Well, it relates to what you're working on here, because I've read these about these surveys. So there was a Pew Foundation survey that said 69% of voters under 30 could vote for a socialist for president, and another poll said 43% of the millennial generation, people born between 1982 and 2004, said that they preferred socialism over capitalism. And so people like me in my generation, I'm 62, and I lived through part of the Cold War, and I'm an economist, and I know that socialism is sort of economic poison. And Venezuela is just the latest horrible example of what a government-run economy can do. I mean, you have no economy when the government takes over that much of it and controls prices and controls the money supply. So I wrote this book called The Problem with Socialism, and my goal was to make it a very easy to read book for the millennial generation mostly, and their parents for that matter, where they can take a look at and learn some of the intellectual arguments against socialism that they obviously don't see in school. They see politicians like Bernie Sanders offering them free stuff, free education, free healthcare, free groceries, whatever, and it's appealing to them.
Right.
But my experience has been when I tell them things like, I don't work for free, and neither does anyone else at the university where I work. So how can education be free?
Mm-hmm.
And my doctor doesn't work for free either. How could healthcare be? Somebody has to pay for it. And so these young people look at me like, gee, I never thought of that before. Some of them, it can't be free. So these politicians are conning them. They're taking them as fools. And I just read today, by the way, that Bernie Sanders, now that he's out of running for president, went out and bought himself a $600,000 vacation home on a lake in Vermont. Yeah. So it pays to do this sort of thing, I guess. And I also read that in Venezuela, as I mentioned, people are starving in Venezuela today, even though they have as much oil as Saudi Arabia does. The wealthiest person there is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, who was the ruler, and she's worth $4.2 billion with a B in Venezuela. So socialism is always very good for the ruling class, but everybody else is sort of equal in their misery and poverty. And we millennials need to know this. That's why I wrote this book.
Right.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's interview thus far. I want to direct your attention to the subscribe button. If you're enjoying it, subscribe for more great interviews to come, as well as go over to facebook.com/Rethinking the Dollar and give me a like there. I share monetary news on a regular basis. Looking forward to bringing you more interviews. Back to this conversation.
Also, speaking of Venezuela, there's a recent documentary from Al Jazeera that talks about the ongoing crisis and how they're trying to vote out the Socialist Party perspective, but yet, just the idea that they still live in the Chavez era. Like they say, Vive Chavez, like in a video, as if it was good for them when he was in power at the time. And now Maduro is their primary figure who's carrying on his policies, but they're still starving. So it's the brainwashing that socialism, I guess, does work for some, because the Venezuelan people still enjoy the policies, even though, their economy is crumbling. So socialism has this way of, I guess, over time becoming acceptable. And that's, one of the concerns or fears I have about our country. So interesting perspective there. Now, in one of your other lectures, you mentioned 10 things. I think it was 10 things about socialism that millennials need to know. What are one or two of those things that you mentioned in that lecture there?
Socialism can ruin your economic future, to be sure.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Another thing would be socialism has always been very bad for the environment. Most people think of the environment, the government needs to control the environment, control pollution. Well, that's true to an extent. It's a good idea that we have rules and laws, liability laws against pollution that can harm people. But when you put government in charge of the environment, they do about as good a job as they do with the post office or the police or anything else government does. And so some of the worst environmental catastrophes in the world have been under socialism. And the former Soviet Union was one example, but other examples is Brazil, where they're having the Olympics. You can go online and read that where they're having the triathlon in Brazil, the water, the virus level, the level of viruses in the water is 1.7 million times higher than what we in the United States would consider to be hazardous. Mm-hmm. And you're from Michigan, so you know about the Flint, Michigan issue with the lead in the water at Flint. And that was a government-run water company.
Right.
And so that was sort of a version of socialism that ruined the water supply in Flint, Michigan. And so that's another lesson. A third lesson is that when the government tries to pursue equality, we have to remember that we're all different. God made each one of us unique and different. We all have different abilities, talents, interests, and so forth. And when governments in history have tried to force equality, they found that they can only do it by getting rid of us a lot of our civil liberties and a lot of our freedoms, and by forcing us to live in ways that we would not choose ourselves to live, and that's a very dangerous road to go down also.
Mm. Wow, interesting. Now let's turn a little bit to the current monetary policies we're under now. A lot of mainstream news media is talk about interest rate hike sometime soon. From an economist standpoint, what's your whole take on this Fed funds rate? Will they be able to raise it? Can they raise it? Will they raise it? What are your opinions, your thoughts?
Well, I don't pretend to be a fortune teller like a lot of economists do, who go on television and they make predictions that never turn out to be right, but they
Yeah,
keep saying them louder and louder, and they make a lot of money at doing it, I guess.
yeah,
But as an economist, one of the things economists are almost unanimously in agreement on is that price controls are a bad idea. When government tries to control prices, it creates all kind of problems. For example, if politicians like to make themselves popular by having laws passed that'll hold down prices. Who doesn't like cheaper stuff to
right,
buy? But then what they usually do is when they do that, and this is what happened in Venezuela, they push them down so far that it doesn't pay to be in business to produce that product or that service. And so people just leave. They don't do it. That's why the grocery shelves are empty in Venezuela today. They push prices down saying, look at me, I'm a popular politician. I'm going to make food cheap for you. And what they did was they made food non-existent.
yeah,
But what the Fed is doing is trying to impose price controls on the price of money, on interest rates. And so from an economic perspective, it's kind of bizarre that you have all these people who run the Fed are all economists. They all have PhD degrees in economics, and they're involved in price controls, which in their own textbooks that they write, like whether it's Ben Bernanke or his successor or anybody else, they say price controls are a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. Then they devote their whole lives in doing it and trying to control the price of money. And so I guess that's how power and prestige can blind people to the obvious reality of how hypocritical they are. Or maybe some people just don't care about being hypocritical as long as they make enough money doing it. And so once you have a job like that, head of the Fed, the sky's the limit as far as how much money you can make when you get out of there. Ben Bernanke, I think I read that his first speech after he retired was the Saudis paid him $250,000,
mm,
and so I guess it's easy to be persuaded to act in a contradictory way from what you've written in your own textbooks for that kind of money.
yeah.
And so that's my take on interest rate manipulation by the Fed. And the Fed causes boom and bust cycles when it does this. That's why we had a bust in 2008. The Fed created the housing bubble with these low interest rates, and then it burst, similar to the stock market, the famous stock market crash of 1929 that caused the Great Depression. We didn't have a Great Depression, but we had a pretty darn bad recession in 2008, 2009, with millions of people losing their jobs. And so, and that's what the Fed has been doing for 100 years.
Right. Now, what are your thoughts, on behind the whole corruption of central banking, how there's the 2% mandated inflation target that, is the goal for the central banking method? Do you actually think that, once they hit or achieve the actual 2%, what would I feel like for regular citizens, and what would happen if they exceed that 2%? How would I look like to the average Joe on the street?
Yeah. Well, they probably have exceeded that 2% now because the government lies about these statistics all the time. There's a website called shadowstats.com. I think it's .com. And if you look up shadow stats, you'll find it. And it's people who take a look at these such things as, for example, if the government used the same formula for unemployment that it did 30 years ago, then the actual unemployment rate would be more than double of what they tell us it is today. And so that's just one example of what I'm talking about. And so that's, that kind of dishonesty is a real problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't really know what the real inflation rate is.
Right, but people will begin feeling it pretty soon, I believe. Now, what's your opinion on the Federal Reserve note? It's the primary world reserve currency. right now all the countries around us are having problems with their currencies as far as it being devalued because of monetary policy. Do you continue to see the dollar remaining as the primary source of, value for the world, or do you see it down the line there happen to be a, monetary shift of power and something else coming about as being the primary source of storing value?
And one thing, one of the reasons why it's still viable is that so many other governments are even worse than ours. And Brazil, I mentioned Brazil, the Olympics were in Brazil, and they had hyperinflation of several thousand% a couple of decades ago, and they still have not totally shaken that off. It's still very expensive to live in Brazil compared to America, as far as that goes. And so one of the reasons why the dollar, as shaky as it is still viable, is that, what's the alternative? All of the alternatives are worse.
Yeah.
But I think, nobody can predict when the dollar would collapse, if it collapsed, and what would happen if that happened. We can move in two directions. We can move in the direction of hyperinflation, of the government printing more and more dollars to bail itself out in its programs, or genuine monetary reform, where we adopted some sort of competing currencies, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that we had in America years ago. Currency based on gold, we can return to some sort of gold-based money, and that's why people like myself have been writing articles and books and teaching about this. When the time comes, we need to have some understanding of what the better alternatives are going to be, or else the politicians will just do more of the same. That's what they did after the 2008 crash. The Fed caused the crash by creating a bubble in real estate, and then its response was to do exactly more of the same thing it had done, creating the bubble in the first place.
Yeah.
And so there's probably another bubble today in real estate in a lot of cities. I have a friend who lives in Las Vegas. Who was a banker during the heyday of real estate in Vegas. He tells me that real estate prices are higher than they were at the peak of the bubble in 2008 now. And so and we have a bubble in student loans. There's a tuition bubble. Mm-hmm. The cost of higher education is just astronomical. And I come right out and tell my students that I think it's immoral what the university charges them for what they get, for the education they get. And, I have tenure by university, so I can say things like that. But I really do believe that. And I hope if I say things like that, maybe a few parents will complain, and somebody will listen, and they'll be a little more realistic about pricing tuition.
Yeah.
And so in the automobile market, there's a bubble in the automobile market now. With zero interest rates, you see ordinary blue-collar working people buying $45,000 cars, and it's hard to find a middle-sized sedan that's less than $35,000 these days. That's a bubble. Yeah. That's a bubble, and so that's where the new bubble is, thanks to the Fed.
Right, so those are clear signs of inflation, it seems like, overall.
Yeah.
Now, I noticed that I think a couple months back you wrote an article in regards to a cashless society. What are your thoughts on, the future? Will there be a cashless society? And then also, last question coming down the home stretch here, helicopter money, quantitative easing, that type of thing. Just give me your thoughts on those two phrases or two concepts, cashless society and helicopter money.
Yeah, quantitative easing or helicopter money comes from some sort of economic theory where some theorist said, well, let's pretend that we dropped money out of the helicopter over the whole country, and the whole country got the same amount of money equally everywhere. And this was it was a theory. But of course, the way it really works is that when the government pursues what it calls quantitative easing, which used to be called inflationary monetary policy, but that had a negative connotation. So the government started calling it quantitative easing as far as that goes. But go on YouTube, by the way, and type in quantitative easing. There's a good cartoon version explaining quantitative easing on there. And I show it to my classes sometimes. But what happens is the government buys bonds, and it puts money, cash that it prints in circulation by doing that. But the New York Goldman Sachs and other New York investment banks, they're the ones who get their hands on that money first. They sell the bonds. They're the brokers, the bond brokers. So they get a hold of this money, and they invest it and reinvest it And by the time you and I, this money filters through bank loans and everything for people like you and me, we've got price inflation. It might be 2 or 3 or 4%, but it's price inflation. And so the people who get their hands on that money first always make out really, really well. That's why all these, whoever heard of a Goldman Sachs executive who did not get bonuses that are 10, 20 million a year bonuses, on top of salary. That's what happened. That's how the system works. That's why I just read yesterday, by the way, that as far as jobs go, one of the big booming sectors in the U.S. economy right now is bartenders and waiters and waitresses.
Really?
And what I think this is saying is that the people who benefit from quantitative easing primarily, they're living high on the hog. They're going out to dinner all the time. They're hanging out at the bars, buying expensive drinks. And so they're fueling the whole bartender restaurant industry. But you look at the other industries, home building and other things, they're not doing so well. But sort of the places that are catered to by the really wealthy, they're doing really well. And that's where the jobs are growing. The government jobs being created and those kinds of jobs. And these are not really high paying jobs. Some of them are, I guess, but not the greatest. And so that's one of the effects of so-called quantitative easing. When I was in college, it was called inflationary monetary policy.
Inflationary
It
monetary.
was more truthful back then.
Yeah. Now, cashless society. Last topic, and then I'll let you go. What's your thoughts on the cashless society?
Well, the governments around the world have been trying to get rid of cash because they can control us and they can control our money electronically. But if we can hold on to cold hard cash, we have a lot more freedom, and we can do what we want. We have more privacy when we can hold an amount of cash or gold, for that matter, precious metals. And so governments don't like that. They want to control us, and they use terrorism as an excuse in our country and elsewhere, where you can't. I just read a few days ago. Isn't it ironic that any American who takes $10,000 out of a bank is going to be scrutinized not just by the IRS, but maybe by the Department of Homeland Security. They'll know about this. The bank is required to tell them. But the president can send $400 million in cash to the Iranians, and that's okay. So the politicians can move cash around however they want, but they want to put limits on us and how we can move our cash around. When I bought a car several years ago, I bought a car and I transferred money from a money market account to my bank account and wrote the check. Car dealer calls me up and said the check bounced, and I'm, what the heck? Check? What do you mean the check bounced?
Mm-hmm.
Turns out that 20% was sent to the IRS without me knowing from that transfer because of the new Patriot Act law and how it affects things. And so the government wants to control us in those ways and a lot of other ways. And if we use cash more and more, it's harder for them to control us. But if it's all electronic, they can do things like this. So I had to, of course, come up with more money.
Yeah.
The IRS, I called the IRS, and they told me, well, you can just consider that a down payment on next year's taxes.
Wow.
And I didn't want to make a down payment.
I bet.
I was forced to make a down payment on next year's taxes.
Wow. That's wow. That right there definitely is a shocker right there. It would definitely make me angry that at first it bounced and then I was told that that's a 20% early payment. So yeah, but Professor Thomas DiLorenzo, I appreciate you sitting down with us here on Rethinking the Dollar. So how can people follow you or stay in tune with what you have going on, lectures coming up, how to get a copy of your books, things like that?
Well, they can check out my book, The Problem With Socialism. It's for sale on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I write columns on a website called LewRockwell.com. It's a man's name, L-E-W, Rockwell.com. And I have a couple hundred articles on there. And they can find me on YouTube like you did. If you type in my name, you see some of my speeches that I've given, public speeches I've given.
All right. Well, Professor DiLorenzo, thanks for sitting down with us. Look forward to staying in touch with you and continue to follow more of your lectures and as well as your writing. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day. Take care.
Too.
Well, this concludes today's episode of Rethinking the Dollar with Professor Thomas DiLorenzo, the author of The Problems with Socialism. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Scroll down below, leave us a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on this interview, as well as click the subscribe button to stay in tune with more RTD news and updates. And also, share this message with your family and friends so they can become more monetarily aware. Looking forward to bringing more RTD interviews. Until we meet again. Thanks.